What's up, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I have a graphic novel that I want to talk to you about. Forever Evil, Arkham War. This collects the Forever Evil Arkham War 6-issue miniseries, as well as Batman issue 23.4, the Bane Spotlight issue, I guess. I think that during the Forever Evil big event that DC did, there was like a Spotlight issue that spotlighted a particular villain for each hero. And so this collects 7 issues, and it is a side story for the big Forever Evil DC event that they did. And I knew absolutely nothing about the Forever Evil story. I still don't know a whole lot about it. All that I know is just context clues that this book provides. And so, still don't know a whole lot about it, but I know a little bit more than what I did before I read this book. And so, basically, this story, the plot is Bane comes from Santa Prisca, and he takes several soldiers from Santa Prisca, and they go to Gotham because the Secret Society of Supervillains has maybe taken over the world, and they've taken away the sun somehow, and they've maybe killed the Justice League, or at least the entire planet thinks that the Justice League is dead. And so, while all of that is going on in the main Forever Evil book, you've got Bane, he comes to Gotham, and he wants to take over Gotham, but the problem is, the inmates of Arkham Asylum have already taken over Gotham, and so he's going to go to war with the Arkham Asylum inmates, hence the name Arkham War, and he is going to basically fight them tooth and nail until he has control of the city. And he is allied with the inmates of Blackgate, which is another prison with supervillains in it, and then the Talons from the Court of Owls, they are thrown into this mix. And I should also mention, I've never read any of Scott Snyder's Batman work except for Gates of Gotham, which I don't even know if Scott Snyder had a whole lot to do with that. From what I understand, he plotted that miniseries but didn't actually write it. So the only thing that I read from him was Gates of Gotham. And so this picks up with a little bit of Scott Snyder stuff, and I was kind of having to pick that up on the go too, because I didn't know anything about the Talons, didn't know anything about those characters, and so they are kind of sort of allied with Bane, or at least one of them is, and then the others are under control of the Arkham inmates. And that's basically the plot of this story. And I hate to say it, but I did not enjoy this miniseries. I really wanted to, because I really like Batman, and I haven't read a new Batman story probably since Batman Earth 1. Before that, I would say the most recent Batman story that I read was one of the I'm trying to think. Either Gates of Gotham or a tie-in to the Battle for the Cowl event. I don't remember which one came later. I guess the Gates of Gotham miniseries came later. And so I read Gates of Gotham, I read Batman Earth 1, but other than that, the most recent Batman story that I read was Batman R.I.P. And I haven't read a whole lot of Batman stuff since then. And so I wanted to get back into the Batman saddle, if you will. I wanted to get back to reading Batman stuff. And I saw this, and it was discounted, so I thought, you know what, I don't know anything about Forever Evil, but this looks kind of fun. I'm going to buy it, I'm going to read it, and hopefully I will enjoy it. And unfortunately, I didn't. And there are several reasons why I didn't like it. First and foremost is the tone. I do not have to have comics be so bloody and violent that if it was a movie, it would be pushing an R rating. I don't have to have that in my comic books. And this has been a problem in American comic books for a very long time. But I'm just going to quickly jump into a little rant here. This could probably be its own video by itself, but for most of my comic book reading career, I've been hearing people talk about how American comics aren't doing so hot and that comic books are failing, and we need to find a way to make people read comics again because the medium is not doing too well. And I would have to say one of the big reasons that comics probably aren't doing as well as we would like is because they are not being aimed at children. And before you get all angry and upset that I just said that, I'm not saying that comic books need to be dumbed down. If you go and look at comics from the 60s and 70s at Marvel Comics, a lot of those comics were aimed at kids. They weren't dumbed down because as an adult, I can go back and read a lot of those comics from the 60s and 70s, and a lot of them are done really well, and as an adult, I can enjoy them. But they were aimed at kids, and kids could read them and enjoy them. And I feel like these days, instead of trying to take that approach, comic book creators are trying to take the approach of, let's do something that's a lot closer to an R-rated movie, and let's try and aim these things at the adults. And the problem with that approach is that 20 years from now, you're not going to have a comic book audience because you're not aiming comic books at kids right now who are going to grow up reading comics. And that's the end of my rant right now, and you may be saying, okay, fine, let's just say that you buy into my idea that this book is way too bloody and violent. Specifically, what is wrong with this book? In the first, 3 pages, Bane takes a manhole cover and chops a dude's face in half by throwing it at him like a frisbee. I don't have to have that in a comic book. I don't have to have somebody get their head ripped off by Bane. I don't have to have stuff like that. You can have a fun adventure comic. You can even have a really high-stakes action comic with a lot of violence, but it doesn't have to be so bloody and grotesque that it makes me say, this is just disgusting, and makes me not want to read it any further. And there was a lot of senseless, disgusting violence here, a lot of really just nasty blood and gore that I don't think really served the story in any way. You could have taken out a lot of the really gory stuff. You could have still had the exact same story. You could have still had this really dark and twisted villain Civil War thing going on without having Bane chop a dude's head in half with a manhole cover. You really don't have to have stuff going on like that. And that kind of took me out of this book. It was harder for me to enjoy this book because of all that senseless violence and gore than it would have been if all that stuff had been taken out. Another thing that I didn't like about this book, this particular story, it feels like that we have covered all of this ground before, and in every other time when it's been covered before, it feels like it was done so much better. I'm specifically thinking of No Man's Land and Nightfall. This really feels like a 7-issue adaptation of No Man's Land and Nightfall. No Man's Land is like a 2-year Batman event from the 1990s where most of Batman's rogues take over Gotham City after a big earthquake happens and Gotham is basically quarantined from the rest of the country. And that was a really good story. And then you had Nightfall, where Bane comes to town and he releases all of the inmates of Arkham, and then Batman, who has the flu, has to go and chase all these guys down and then take them all in. And then once he's done all that, Bane comes in and breaks his back, and then he takes over the criminal underworld. This story isn't very different from either of those, but the problem is both Nightfall and No Man's Land were done so much better than this. And a big reason is because this tries to tackle both of those stories in just 7 issues, whereas No Man's Land is something like 2,000 pages long when you consider all of the little side stories that are part of it. And Nightfall was probably like 1,000 pages long when you consider all of the side stories and everything. I also get a sense that this book is kind of trying to ride the coattails of The Dark Knight Returns. There is one particular scene here where Bane and Talon, or one of the Talons, are riding horses, and I instantly saw that and thought, I wonder where they got this from. And again, it feels like this book is trying to take some of the best Batman stories and then try and remake them and redo them, but it's not doing a good job of it. You could just go back and reread No Man's Land, Nightfall, and Dark Knight Returns, and you would get a much better story there than what you're getting here. This is trying to take some really huge ideas that have been done before and were done really well because the people doing those stories took their time and really explored what they were doing, took a lot of time and space to do those stories. This tries to do those things in just 7 issues, and it doesn't work. And that moves me on to my next point in that this is too short, and there are way too many characters here. There's about 40,000 villains in this story, and I don't ever get the feeling that I get to know any of them, except for Bane, one of the Talons. I kind of get to feel like we know him, and he's allied with Bane, and it's weird that I feel like I get to know him a little bit because he isn't even introduced until about halfway into the book. And then Scarecrow. Those 3 are really the only ones who we get to know. And the Penguin, I guess. We'll throw in the Penguin. There's still about 100 other villains who show up in this book, and it's really hard for me to get a sense of what's going on because every time we see a big 2-page spread of all of these villains fighting each other, it's hard for me to figure out, okay, is this guy from Arkham Asylum or is he from Blackgate? I don't know. Is he fighting with Bane? Is he fighting against Bane? I don't know. It's really hard for me to get a sense of what's going on here because there are way too many characters here. And this kind of sort of leads into another complaint I had. This is tied in with the Forever Evil story, but I really feel like the concept here, the idea of a big, huge villain civil war in Gotham City, would have worked much better as its own story. Instead of having this be tied to Forever Evil, which I haven't read and I kind of doubt I ever will because the concept doesn't seem that interesting to me, instead of having this be tied to that, just have this be its own thing. You could have it be about 1/3 or 2/3 longer than what it is. You could really get to explore all of what what's going on here, tackle all of the sides here. You've got the Penguin, who's kind of trying to play both sides. You've got the Blackgate prisoners, and then you've got the Arkham prisoners, and then you've got Bane, and he's trying to take over the city. You could have really done all of that as its own story. You could have completely left out all of the Forever Evil stuff, and I really feel like this would have worked better as its own thing if it had been a little bit longer. And my final complaint with this book is that it's just way too anticlimactic. We spend 6 issues with Bane fighting the Arkham people, and finally he wins, and finally it looks like he's trying to turn this city into a slightly more livable place, and then out of nowhere, Batman comes in the last 10 or 15 pages, and he wipes the floor with Bane and all of the Talons who are left over, and then he says, okay, the city is safe again, and everyone's like, yay, Batman's back, and it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Of course, there's really no other way that you could end this story. When you have Batman seemingly incapacitated with the rest of the Justice League, and you have every Batman villain ever fighting this turf war in Gotham City, how else are you going to end it than with Batman coming in and cleaning up his town? But I almost feel like Batman coming in and restoring order to his city could have been its own story. You could have done 7 issues of the villains fighting each other, and then you could have done another 6 issues of Aftermath with Batman and the Bat family coming in and trying to reclaim their city. And maybe I'm thinking that because that's already been done before in No Man's Land. A lot of No Man's Land was Batman and his family trying to reclaim their city from the villains who had taken it over. And so it feels really sloppy and really rushed that Batman is able to reclaim his city in the span of 10 pages. And again, it's anticlimactic. I don't really feel like this story earns that ending. I don't really feel like it means anything if Batman comes in and kicks the crap out of Bane, because where's he been this whole time? I don't know. And that's one of those things, I guess I have to go and read Forever Evil to find out where Batman has been. But if you're just reading this story, you don't know where he's been. He just comes in out of nowhere, and with no effort at all, he beats up Bane, and then the city is saved. This ending is a huge letdown. The whole story, frankly, was a letdown. I didn't really understand or enjoy most of this story. I mean, I understood the plot. The plot is fairly straightforward. You've got this group of villains fighting this group of villains, but very rarely did I actually enjoy this story. Most of the time, I was kind of just like, okay, this is just villains fighting each other. There's really not a whole lot of substance here. There's really not a whole lot going on here. And that's sad because I really wanted to enjoy this. When I saw the cover, I thought, this looks like a really cool story. And by the way, the cover is very misleading, or you might could have figured that out, because Batman doesn't even show up until the last 10 or 15 pages. So don't think that this is a big Batman versus Bane story, because it's not, despite what the cover lets you think that it is. And so I wanted to like this story. I really wanted to like it. And to be honest, I want to like Batman, but it's looking more and more like everything since the New 52 is kind of making it harder and harder for me to want to like Batman, because a lot of the stuff that I've seen and heard is like, that's not something that I would want to read. I don't know why they're doing that. So this is a very good example of that. Do I recommend Batman or Forever Evil Arkham War? Only if you have never read any other Batman story ever, basically. If you haven't read No Man's Land or Nightfall or even The Dark Knight Returns, because I do feel like that horse riding scene is kind of a riff on The Dark Knight Returns. It's trying to make you think of that. If you haven't read any of those stories, you might really love this story. And if you've read Forever Evil and you thought, this was a great story, now I want more, I want to see what else was going on during this story, you might want to check this out and see if this is as good as Forever Evil. I haven't read Forever Evil, so I don't know. And also, if you like the modern Batman, if you like the really edgy, really dark and twisted version of Batman that we've basically had since Scott Snyder's been writing, then you'll probably like this a lot. But this version of Batman is just a little too gruesome for me, a little too dark. And I don't mean Batman himself, I mean the world of Batman is a little too gruesome and dark for my taste. And so, that's my thoughts. I didn't enjoy it, but if you are one of those people, if one of those things applies to you, then you might enjoy it. If you've read this book before and you liked it, let me know why in the comments below. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week with a different kind of video. So I will see you guys then. Have a great rest of the day.